SDC, there's a stark warning for Android users about a series of apps they need to delete right away. More concerns about updates for the billion iPhone users out there. And Facebook is making a huge mistake on the whole encryption debate all over again.
Go on, let's start with that, Zach. What's this mistake that's being made?
So Facebook has funded, if not sponsored, a new report into the value of encryption, which none of us would seek to argue against. Clearly, there's huge value in us being able to send secure messages to, individual recipients or to groups, and we all do that all of the time. As we know, Facebook is 3 years now into its plans to try and encrypt all of the messaging across all of its platforms. And we've seen in the last week or two, the European Union talk about interoperability between messaging, which will push that debate even further. Where Facebook gets it wrong, though, is it deliberately or inadvertently misses the differentiation between messaging applications and social media applications. It's absolutely right that WhatsApp and Signal and others should be encrypted. It's absolutely right that we will advise users not to use, say, Telegram, which isn't end-to-end encrypted, and opt for WhatsApp or Signal instead, which are. It's absolutely right that we advocate for iMessage to be interoperable with, say, Google Messages, because they are two messaging apps, and they have now, with Google's latest updates, they can both be end-to-end encrypted. They can't talk to each other, which is pretty silly. But that's very different than encrypting Instagram or Facebook Messenger, because they are social media applications. You can't go on to WhatsApp or Signal and browse for people to contact. They're not apps designed for use by children, which is completely different to Facebook and Instagram, where you can absolutely browse, peruse, scroll through the site, find people, and then seek to contact them. They're social media platforms. You can pretend to be somebody else, and then you can, use that alias, if you like, to groom, to groom victims. And we've seen lots of talk about that. So child protection agencies and charities constantly rally against this. And if you like, the argument back from Facebook is, look, all end-to-end encryption is the same, and that's clearly not the case. It's quite okay to have something like a Facebook Messenger, which does have tools and techniques to protect vulnerable adults and children without compromising the security in, say, WhatsApp and other end-to-end encrypted apps.
I guess the key message in here is that not all messaging apps are the same. Some are for different purposes. Some are designed for secure means like Signal, and others are designed, they are used by children. So people just need to be educated. They need to know how they're meant to be using these apps and which ones are safe to communicate on and which ones aren't.
Exactly right. And Facebook is treading dangerous ground, in my view, because, we know that, security agencies and lawmakers in the US and the UK, Australia and elsewhere are rallying against the inability for security agencies to penetrate end-to-end encryption in the hunt for, child predators, in the hunt for people traffickers, in the hunt for serious and organised criminals, terrorists, and the like. At the moment, there's almost like an uneasy status quo where there isn't really a big campaign globally to penetrate WhatsApp. We've seen some local action in places like India. There's talk in the EU, but in terms of a wholesale change, that isn't really on the cards. But Facebook is kind of poking the bear, if you like. My view is, if it actually goes forwards and says, we're going to extend that umbrella or that envelope of end-to-end encryption across all of our platforms, I think they're opening the door for lawmakers to say, okay, in which case, then we will introduce compromises. Now, what's really interesting with that is that, I think from a Facebook commercial perspective, I don't think they'd care. I think they'd accept the compromise, because what they want is a very sticky, messaging empire, where they can start to bring WhatsApp into the fold. WhatsApp, used by 2 billion users, doesn't really tightly integrate in with the other platforms. But for a WhatsApp user, it's a huge issue. And for WhatsApp itself, it's a huge issue. And I think in the last 2 years, certainly in the last year, we've seen some of the messaging out of WhatsApp kind of throwing some of what Facebook does a bit under a bus on the messaging side. And I suspect we are getting to a place, particularly with the metaverse, where it's time served on the idea that WhatsApp is owned by Facebook. That's always been an uneasy relationship.
Okay, so let's stick with security and apps. or even more to the point, security apps. Checkpoint Research have published a new report this week that found no less than 6 Android antivirus apps, they were posing as antivirus apps, in the Google Play Store that were actually spreading a fairly nasty, in fact, a very dangerous Trojan called Sharkbot, which is a banking Trojan. It's a credential stealer, and it scoops up all your banking information as well.
So what can you do in terms of, okay, so I might have downloaded a bad app. How do you know if it's a bad app or not? And how do you kind of more generally protect against that?
Well, this is the problem, you see, because what the threat actors here have done is they've leveraged the trust that most users implicitly have in security apps. More to the point, they've leveraged the trust in those antivirus apps that have made it through Google's protection and got into the official Play Store. We're always saying don't download apps from unofficial Play Stores, but this is the official Google Play Store. Now they've got Bouncer and all other sorts of protections that are meant to prevent these apps from getting in there in the first place, but they've obviously patently failed. I've actually got a question in with them at the minute, asking them to explain how these things got in and what they're going to do to prevent them getting in future. Whether I'll get a response or not, you'll find out when my article's published. But it's also interesting if we look at attribution for this particular round of Sharkbot attacks. Although the researchers are very clear that they say they can't actually make a positive attribution because there isn't enough evidence. They're also saying that you can say with some confidence that the threat actors are Russian speaking, and all of these Sharkbot infected apps were flagged so that they wouldn't run if your device locale was Belarus, China, India, Romania, Russia, or Ukraine.
I thought they were, you know, with Russia disconnecting itself from the internet, I thought we'd kind of seen the end of this, and it had been made much harder. But yet again, we've kind of seen, you know, one of these geographically specific, you know, dangerous apps or series of apps coming out, which is kind of targeting, you know, the other side of the world, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you've got to be careful with attribution because there is a lot of false flagging that goes on. The researchers at Checkpoint have said quite clearly there's not enough evidence to actually attribute this to anybody. And of course, just because the threat actors are Russian speaking and they flagged it not to run in those countries doesn't mean that this is some sort of state sponsored exercise. There's lots of threat actors who speak Russian. They're just cyber criminals, nothing more. So we stick with vulnerabilities and smartphones just for a second, because there's another one that's piqued my attention as my secondary smartphone, if you like, that I tend to use as a burner these days, is a Samsung Galaxy Note S10 Plus, I think is the full name of the thing. And these researchers have found that this most popular series of smartphones, of Android devices, far more popular than any other, Samsung outsell everybody else in this sector, have been exposed to a really nasty vulnerability for years. And it impacts all Samsung devices that are running Android from versions 9 right through to 12. And what it is, it's a vulnerability in the pre-installed phone app that comes on Samsung's devices. And what it means is that any third-party app with 0 privileges required can get full authorization on that device to perform privileged operations. So factory reset, they could make calls, can install, uninstall apps, and so on. So this is a really serious thing. Now, let's say up front it's been fixed. The researchers disclosed it to Samsung back in November last year. The patch to fix this vulnerability went out with the February Samsung security maintenance release, but that doesn't mean that everybody's got it. And because it affects devices going back so long, I think it's well worth checking to see what your security update status is and make sure that it's February onwards.
And David, do we know if this vulnerability has already been exploited by attackers?
No news of that at all. I suspect not, because it was disclosed to Samsung back in November last year. Although it did take a relatively long time to patch it. There's a big gap between November and February. So who knows? But there's nothing official. No.
Yeah, always a problem, isn't it? That's the thing. And we've seen recently a lot of already exploited vulnerabilities being patched by Apple as well. There are a few complaints over the last update, which was iOS 15.4.1, because we also found out that automatic updates weren't so automatic after all. I mean, we already knew it because it was taking ages if you left auto updates on to come to your phone. So a lot of people have been saying to me that iOS 16, which has now been announced, will be announced at WWDC, Apple's developer conference in June, on June 6th, might actually change that if this if people are actually listened to. So are we going to start to see more automatic updates from Apple? Are we going to see Apple, as it did with iOS 15, still update the previous iOS version? So when we get 16, is it going to update iOS 15? This update cycle, even whether you're talking about Android, whether you're talking about Apple, it isn't perfect. Apple has always had people saying, well, you're better at it and they are more timely with updates. It all goes out at once, but actually that's not really true. And that's something we've started to see recently.
This is really interesting because from the security side of things, because take Google, for example, Google Chrome, which I've been writing about a lot recently because of the proliferation of vulnerabilities. In particular, there was an emergency update that just dealt with one 0 day that was already being exploited a week or two back. And just this week, I've been writing about another security update that is for just one solitary vulnerability, not known to have been exploited, but it's still a fairly serious one. And I'm wondering now if Google are going to actually be releasing security updates as and when they happen. So this idea of emergency out of band updates is a bit of a legacy thing, and perhaps it's just going to be a rolling update with anything that hits a certain vulnerability risk barrier. When it hits that ceiling, boom, they release the update. They don't wait for another 2-3 weeks to roll it out with the rest of the updates. And I'm wondering if Apple, because there was talk before that Apple were going to do this with iOS, wasn't there, that they have separate security updates, and that doesn't seem to have materialized into much.
Yeah, I could definitely see that happening actually, because Apple has just been ploughing out the security updates over the last year or so, and we've seen a lot of point versions, smaller versions of the point versions that is, that have been purely emergency security updates. I mean, one of the most important of those was to fix a vulnerability that was allegedly exploited by Pegasus. So you can imagine they put out, just as an emergency on their own. And I think that's a really good way of doing things, really, because it does separate out the feature updates from the security updates as well. It makes it easier for users to know what's important to update to and what's maybe not so important.
I guess Apple's now got to go back to the drawing board and think about its walled garden, right? So, I mean, I know we haven't seen a lot of talk out of Apple yet, but, the side-loading apps, interoperability with iMessage, the way that it interfaces with the rest of the world, this is huge, right? I don't know if we've missed anything or there's any gossip coming out, but certainly I think that's going to be right at the top of the agenda for June.
Yeah, we've seen a lot kind of on the physical side of iOS in terms of copying Android and making it more adaptable, more like Android itself, because iOS has always been a very closed operating system, and actually even the design of it didn't really fit what people wanted. So perhaps we will start to see that a bit further. At the moment, the rumour mill hasn't really even started going. It's more of a, what do we want from iOS? Well, we do want it to be more open, definitely, and I think we want it to be more secure and more timely as well. On the privacy side, Apple's been doing really, really well. We have seen lots of updates there, and we probably will see quite a few more. Maybe things will become a little bit more overt in terms of permissions. Maybe we'll start to see more pop-up boxes rather than the settings being a bit more hidden in the privacy settings. But it's definitely going to be interesting, and only a couple of months to go. So lots of time for rumours, but also
I'll tell you what I want. All you developers out there, here you go, you can have this one for free. I want iOS Droid. I want the best of both. in one platform. And let's just go with that. Go on, do it.
Definitely.
Yes, there are some benefits in terms of the way Apple's walled garden works, and there was a quirky story, a timely story out this week, just in terms of the Apple's Find My network, which I know we've talked about before on SDC, which is almost like a quasi shadow radio network that operates across Apple's install base. And there was kind of talk about some of the looting that's taken place by the Russians in Ukraine, and Apple's this Find My network actually being able to work out where some of these devices had been taken to, which kind of reminded me of the story back in the US a couple of years ago, where there was looting taking place in some US cities and iPhones being stolen out of Apple stores. They were running the same kind of network, and it was disabling the device and working out where it was, and informing the police and all the rest of it. It's just quite an interesting little subtext here. There's clearly phone theft, device theft, computer theft remains a huge issue. The industry can obviously do more. These devices carry networks kind of identifiers, they device identifiers. There was another story this week about Apple no longer repairing devices that have been reported stolen. So I think we saw something similar with car theft, and clearly manufacturers can do a lot more to track cars, identify stolen cars. Maybe we'll see over the next couple of years far more of a move in that direction as well. Whether it's Apple only, Google only, or you get your wish for iOS Droid, Dave, remains to be seen.